Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, with a second presentation looking at the impact of the blockades. This time, specifically their impact on the home fronts, and the impact that had on the outcome of the war, asking the obvious question, were they successful? We can measure the success of the British blockade out at sea. So successful was it that in the length of the war, it's thought that only around 650 ships managed to evade it. But it's in Germany and Austria-Hungary actually, particularly in their cities, where it brought tremendous suffering and where mortality rates of all social groups rose, that the effect of the British blockade is really seen. Civilians scavenged for food. There was constant hunger, and in winter, freezing cold. This is why the Germans called it the hunger blockade. There is a second effect to think about though, for it brought serious political problems for the German state. In 1915, just over 88,000 deaths were attributed to the British blockade, and there were strikes and riots. This rose to over 120,000 deaths in 1916, when there were food riots in more than 30 German cities. At the end of June 1916, there was a 3-day strike with 55,000 German workers taking part. It was more of the same in 1917, when 250,000 German lives were attributed to the British blockade. And in July 1917, the Reichstag passed a peace resolution by 212 votes to 126. The winter of 1916-17 was known as the turnip winter. As with the failure of the potato crop, the turnip became just about the only thing available to eat. Germans died of malnutrition, and it's always the young and the elderly who are affected first. Deaths caused by tuberculosis rose 90% over the length of the war in towns of 15,000 or more. Typhoid deaths doubled between 1916 and 1917. Dysentery was another problem, and a growing number of children had rickets. This is a softening and weakening of the bones caused by a lack of vitamin D. Scurvy, a condition caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, and that can result in a number of symptoms, from bleeding gums to tiredness, was also a growing problem. It's thought that 294,000 Germans died in 1918 as a result of the blockade. And as I said, the cities were hardest hit. And in January 1918, 400,000 workers in Berlin went on strike, demanding peace. Within 48 hours, the strikes had spread to 6 other major cities. The German government responded swiftly and firmly. Martial law was declared in Berlin and Hamburg, and striking workers were drafted into the army. In total, German deaths attributable to the blockade, something very hard to establish with certainty, and I'm using post-war German statistics, could have been as high as 750,000 people, as many as the British lost on the Western Front. No wonder Germans referred to the blockade as the hunger blockade. Germany always struggled to meet the shortfalls. Meat substitutes were produced. Bread was rationed as early as January 1915, and Kriegsbrot, that's war bread, was made of flour made from potatoes, corn, lentils, and at desperate times even sawdust. To control supplies, the government also imposed restrictions. so that no fats could be sold on a Monday, no meat on Tuesdays and Fridays, and no flour at weekends. To save grain, the government also ordered the slaughter of 1 million pigs in 1915, about a third of their total number. However, in the long term this led to less vegetables being grown, as it destroyed a valuable source of manure. In 1916, further goods were rationed: potatoes in April, butter and sugar in May, meat in June, eggs, milk and fats in November. It should also be noted that though these goods might be rationed, they still might not be affordable, nor even available. In their place, substitutes were used. Acorns were used as a substitute for coffee, though they were themselves in short supply as they were now being fed to the pigs. There was also a meatless meat made of grains, nuts and vegetables. As a vegetarian, I eat that kind of thing regularly, but I don't think the Germans appreciated it. Near the end of 1916, the government did decree that workers in heavy industry could receive extra rations, as well as pregnant women, and children under 6 were allowed full milk. Nevertheless, by 1917, most Germans were eating around 1,000 calories a day, when the recommended intake today is 2,000 calories for women and 2,500 for men. As a consequence of the shortages, of course, prices rose, doubling by 1916. That led to a black market that by 1918 was the source of 1/3 of total food supplies, according to some estimates. Industrialists buying up food for their workers accounted for much of it. Food was also more available in the countryside, and those living in the cities would sometimes travel into the countryside to buy food or else barter for it, or even steal it, even though they ran the risk of having the food confiscated by inspectors at railway stations as they returned. The government ordered food kitchens to be opened in the cities and larger towns, and by early 1917 almost 500 towns and cities had a total of more than 2,200 kitchens. In Hamburg in 1917, for example, 20% of the population were taking a meal from a soup kitchen, though by this point ration cards would have to be used if people made use of the kitchens. As for the German blockade on Britain, though it had serious consequences for the British people, and there was some malnutrition, it was nothing compared to what Germans suffered. In fact, as labour shortages ended unemployment and drove up real wages, that's wages taking account of inflation, nutrition standards actually improved for some, and mortality rates for women and older men improved too. Yet in April 1916, there was a real shortage of wheat, with only 6 weeks of supply left. This was the result of a combination of things: the German blockade, but also a poor harvest in 1915, and a shortage of agricultural labourers as more and more men enlisted. And when the Germans resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, the government took control of over 2.5 million acres of land for farming, and there was an extra 3 million taken over by the end of the war. This led to the creation of the Women's Land Army to work the land. The rationing of basic foodstuffs also needed to be phased in. Voluntary rationing was introduced in February 1917, basically encouraging people to eat less. And from the end of 1917, compulsory rationing began with sugar and meat. followed by butter and margarine and cheese through the first half of 1918. The government also controlled food prices, but ration books were not introduced until the war was almost over. Now, compare this to what was happening in Germany. And a final point about the war at sea as a whole. The war at sea also had an early impact on the battlefields of Europe. We should not forget that the British Navy had successfully overseen the transportation of the British Expeditionary Force to France in August 1914, without the loss of a single man, and continued to transport troops throughout the war, including those from the far-flung reaches of the Empire. Indeed, the Entente powers were able to transport their troops and supplies to most fronts, and American soldiers crossed the Atlantic, thus helping tip the balance in 1918. There were some losses, but not so that it discouraged them. So, we can clearly see that of the two blockades, the German blockade failed in its aims. The British blockade and its general control of the seas was extremely important to ultimate victory. Ultimately, the war of attrition was won on the battlefields, but that war was also fought at sea, as much as in the appalling loss of life on those battlefields, and should not be forgotten. Now, before I go, let me remind you of my website, History Made Easier, that's there to help you too. But for now, let me simply thank you for listening and wish you the very best of luck in your studies. Cheers.